Chapter 1. Dr. Wesley Hardy walked into his home behind his office, rubbing his eyes. He was exhausted, and there was no dinner cooking. He needed to hire a woman to come in and cook his meals. Better yet, he needed to get married, so he would have someone cooking his meals as well as cleaning for him. But who could he possibly find? There were 4 unattached women in Butterfly Meadows, and 2 were prostitutes. Of the other 2, one was 16, and much too young for a man of 32, and the other was 57, and her bad temper was legendary in all of South Dakota. No, he didn't want to marry anyone he knew. The last time he'd been in town, he'd seen an advertisement for a newspaper that was called the Groom's Gazette. He knew it advertised men who were looking to marry women back east. Women who wanted to marry a man in the West. He wasn't exactly a cowboy, but he was a man of the West. Now, he'd started out in New York City, but there hadn't been a terrible need for doctors there. No, Butterfly Meadows was where he belonged. Now he just had to find a way to bring a suitable woman here to be his bride. He sat down, picking up his pen, and ignoring his rumbling stomach. Dear potential bride. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Dr. Wesley Hardy, and I'm a doctor in the beautiful town of Butterfly Meadows, South Dakota. We're a small town, but we have enough of the comforts of the East to be habitable by a gentle lady. I'm 32 years old, and I have all my teeth. I've never been told that foul odors emanate from my person, and my face has never made small children run away in horror. I'm looking for a bride who enjoys cooking and cleaning. I would prefer someone between the ages of 25 and 30. I'm not fussy about appearance, but would consider myself fortunate indeed if she had red hair. If this sounds like you, and you are willing to make your way to Butterfly Meadows and see what my town has to offer, please let me know. I will happily pay your train fare. Sincerely, Dr. Wesley Hardy. He read through his words once more, looking for errors. He couldn't make a bad first impression on the woman who would someday be his wife. After pushing the letter away, he got to his feet to see about supper. Surely there was something he could make that would be palatable. Asterisk. Patsy Lawrence brushed the hair out of her face, noticing that her hand was covered with blood. The new mother was holding her baby and cooing to her happily, and her sister was beside her. I'm going to go clean up and then call in Bob. He's going to be so proud of his son. The mother looked up with tears in her eyes. Thank you. I don't know what I'd have done without you. Patsy smiled, going to the pump and washing her hands and face. She hoped she didn't need another bath. She'd taken one just a few hours before she was called to birth the baby. She'd been a midwife since before her daughter was born, and she thanked God every day she'd taken up the vocation. When her husband had died unexpectedly 5 years before, she had been able to support herself and her little girl, Emily, while taking the time to grieve. So many women would have had to marry again right off, but she'd not been in that position, and she was thankful. After scrubbing herself up to her elbows with lye soap, she smiled down at the new mother. I'll come by tomorrow to check on you. She looked at the new aunt. Are you going to stay and help with meals for a day or two? Alice, an old schoolmate of Patsy's, nodded. I will be here for as long as she needs me. We'll send for you if something goes awry, but I'm sure she'll be fine. Thank you so much for helping us. Patsy gave a tired wave. You know I'm here whenever I'm needed. Did you leave Emily with your mother? Patsy nodded. I did. I'm off to get her now. It was after 11 at night, and she and her daughter both should have been in bed hours before. The walk through the city of Beckham, Massachusetts was always eerie at this time of night. She was used to the streets filled with people, rushing to where they needed to be. Her job as a midwife had kept her and her daughter fed and clothed for the past 5 years, but she was becoming discontent. She was ready to marry again and have more children of her own. There was nothing in the world more precious than holding a newborn and knowing you got to keep them, not having to give them to their mother as soon as they were clean. She loved her daughter with everything inside her, even though she wasn't the most ladylike little girl who had ever graced Beckham. No, Emily preferred to climb trees and run around playing tag and baseball, to sitting quietly doing embroidery. Because Patsy worked so much, her daughter had been allowed to run a bit wild. She knew she needed to take her in hand, but she also knew the girl would find her way. Eventually, she'd be happy to sit in a dress and be a lady. It just might not be tomorrow. Patsy stopped at her mother's house, rapping softly on the door. She never knew what to expect after a late-night delivery. Sometimes Emily would keep her mother up until all hours, and other times, Emily would be sound asleep and have to be carried home. Her mother hurried to the door, pointing to where Emily was sleeping soundly on the sofa. "I guess I'm going to be carrying her home tonight." Her mother smiled. "I guess you are. Did the delivery go well?" Patsy nodded. "As well as any first births do. Both mother and baby are healthy. She had a little boy." "Oh, that's lovely. Have they named him yet?" "Not unless they did it after I left." Patsy stifled a yawn with her hand. "I should be on my way. I need to get some sleep while I can. I have 3 more mothers who are close to their due dates, and I take my rests whenever possible." She stepped into the house and went to pick Emily up, putting the girl's arms over her shoulders, and wrapping her legs around her waist to make it easier on herself. "I'll see you soon, Mama. Thank you for watching her." Her mother frowned as she opened the door, and Patsy understood. She looked tired, because she was. She hadn't eaten in 12 hours since she was summoned to the birthing. She needed to go home and fix herself a meal, but most likely, she'd get Emily into her nightgown and fall into her own bed, exhausted. That's how her days went. She needed to find a husband, someone who could take some of the burden. She'd probably still deliver babies, but it would be nice if she got some breaks from it. She closed her eyes, thinking about how easy life would be if she married again. Maybe she would go see Elizabeth Tandy, one of her favorite people at church. She had a mail-order bride agency. Certainly there was someone who was willing to take on a 27-year-old widow with a sweet little girl. It was a big country. As she drifted off to sleep, she made her decision. She'd do it. She was too tired not to. Asterisk. After seeing Emily off to school the following morning, Patsy made the short walk to Rock Creek Road, where Elizabeth Tandy lived in a huge house with her new husband, Bernard. She knocked on the door, and Mr. Tandy opened it, smiling at her. "Are you here to see Elizabeth?" Patsy nodded, hoping she didn't look as nervous as she felt. It wasn't every day a woman went to a matchmaker in hopes of finding a husband. "Yes, is she in?" "She's in her office." "I take it this is a business call?" Bernard's eyes were discerning as he studied her face. "Yes, I'm here to speak with her about becoming a mail-order bride." Bernard nodded, opening the door wide. "If you'll follow me, Mrs. Lawrence." Patsy followed him down the long hall to the last door on the left, where Elizabeth was sitting at her desk, working on something. Bernard cleared his throat. "My dear, Patsy Lawrence is here to see you." Elizabeth turned from her desk, her smile lighting up the room. "Patsy, it's good to see you." She hurried across the room and hugged Patsy. "I have a feeling this call is more business than pleasure. Am I right?" Patsy nodded. "Am I so transparent?" Elizabeth shrugged. "I've been watching you. When you first lost your husband, I thought about stepping in and offering to find you a husband, but I could see you needed time to grieve. You and Joseph were wonderful together, and I know it was a blow when he died. I've seen that in the past few months you've been ready for more, because now you always look tired instead of sad." Patsy frowned. "Am I really that transparent?" "Probably not to other people, but it's my job to read people." I actually got a letter just yesterday that I considered bringing to you. I even wrote your name on my list next to his." "Really?" Patsy was surprised. She liked Elizabeth a lot, but everyone did. She had no idea the other woman had been watching her closely enough to notice. "May I see the letter?" Elizabeth waved her to the couch. "Sit. I'll find it." She turned and saw Bernard hovering at the door. "Tea and cookies?" He nodded. "Yes, my love." Elizabeth blushed slightly as he hurried away, before she turned to the stack of papers on her desk, digging through them until she found something. "Here. This is the one. I think Dr. Hardy would be perfect for you." "Doctor?" Patsy held out her hand for the letter Elizabeth was offering her. She looked down and smiled at the sloppy handwriting. She'd never known a doctor to write legibly. She read through it twice, her lips pursed in thought. "He does sound like he'd be right for me. Do you think he'd accept Emily?" Elizabeth shrugged. "He didn't mention children either way, and usually that means he won't mind. Write to him, and we'll see." "How long does this process usually take?" "Not as long as it used to. It'll take 7 to 10 days to arrive in South Dakota, and then the same amount of time for it to come back. If he receives the letter and responds the day it arrives in South Dakota, it could be as short as 2 or 3 weeks to have a response." "All right. I'll send him a letter and see what he thinks. I'm nervous, but I think it's time Emily had a father again, and I've been working too hard. I need a man who's able to support Emily and me. I think Dr. Hardy is just the man you're looking for." Elizabeth smiled as Bernard came in with cookies and tea. "Would you like to join us?" "Patsy has chosen her letter." Bernard shook his head. "No, I wouldn't dream of interfering with your tea. You ladies enjoy, and I'll be off to the post office as soon as you've crafted your response, Mrs. Lawrence." Elizabeth handed Patsy a pen and paper before she poured the tea and offered the plate of cookies. "Just write what feels natural. Make sure you don't lie or make any embellishments. I think you're exactly what the good doctor needs, whether he knows it yet or not." Patsy smiled at that. "I will do my very best." Asterisk. Wesley looked up from his desk, where he was making notes on a patient's chart. He'd found, at least for him, careful record-keeping is what made his practice less chaotic. "Percival. What can I do for you?" Percival was the owner of the general store across the street from Wesley's office and home, and the postmaster for the town. "You have a letter from Massachusetts. Thought you might want it right away, since you don't often get letters from back east." Wesley smiled, holding out his hand for the letter. He received letters from back east frequently, as the other man knew, so he wasn't sure why Percival was there. He took it and frowned at the address for a moment, before his eyes widened. He hadn't expected a reply from the matchmaker he'd written to quite so quickly. "Thank you." Percival stood over him, obviously interested in what the letter had to say. Wesley refused to open it in front of the busybody. Percival and his wife, Dorothy Ann, were the biggest gossips in town. Well, Percival gathered the information while Dorothy Ann spread it around. They made quite a team. "Is there something else you needed, Percival?" The older man frowned, shaking his head as he walked out the door. He obviously wasn't happy with being dismissed, but Wesley didn't much care. He wanted to read his letter in peace. "Dear Dr. Hardy, I'm a 27-year-old widow with a 7-year-old daughter named Emily. I have red hair and green eyes from my Irish mother's side of the family. My husband passed away 5 years ago, and I have been supporting my daughter and myself by working as a midwife. I love the idea of moving out west. I think you sound like you would be a good husband for me, and a good father for my little girl. I'm not sure if you're willing to accept a wife who has a child, and I will understand if you are not. I have always enjoyed cooking, and I am willing to clean as much as the next woman. Please consider my daughter and me. We would be willing to leave soon. Yours, Patsy Lawrence. Wesley read her letter again and drew a pen and paper to him. He hadn't given a thought to the idea of a woman with a child answering his letter, but he wouldn't be opposed to a little girl. He smiled as he thought of a delicate little girl who sat and played with dolls and drank tea with her mother. Why, being surrounded by all that feminine beauty would be a true joy for him. He quickly penned a letter and walked across the street to buy 2 train tickets. He would be thrilled to have a wife. It was all that his life was lacking. Chapter 2. When Patsy stepped off the train with Emily's hand in hers, she looked around the area, hoping Wesley had remembered they were arriving today. She had to keep reminding herself that she would call him Wesley, not Dr. Hardy. A wife rarely used her husband's title unless she was odd. Patsy was odd, of course, but she wasn't that odd. Finally, she spotted a man who looked to be in his mid-30s, who was well-dressed, standing off to the edge of the platform. She raised a hand in a wave, hoping she wasn't being too forward. The man nodded to her and slowly made his way over to where she stood with Emily. As he did, she glanced down at Emily, making certain her daughter looked her best. The girl was so tired after over a week of travel that she hadn't even complained when Patsy had forced her into her Sunday dress and put a bow in her hair at the last stop. Very unusual for Emily. When the man made his way to her, she smiled. Please tell me you're Dr. Hardy? He nodded. Yes, I am. And you're Patsy? And this lovely little girl must be Emily? He noticed that Emily was clinging to her mother's hand and trying to disappear behind her skirts, just the kind of behavior he'd expect from a ladylike girl. Yes, I'm Patsy. It's nice to meet you. She had her waist-length red hair pulled into a bun atop her head. She'd thought about wearing it down, because of his comment in his initial letter about preferring redheads, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. I've arranged with the pastor that we will be marrying immediately upon arriving in Butterfly Meadows. Is that all right with you? Patsy nodded. I wouldn't have felt that I could spend the night under the same roof with you otherwise. He nodded. That's understandable. It's a 30-minute drive to my town by buggy. Looks like Emily needs to nap the whole way. She looked down at her daughter with a smile. It's been a long trip. She's never been confined on a train this way, and it's been hard on her. Wesley was a little surprised at that. He could understand a boy not wanting to be confined on a train, because boys were active and boisterous. Not sweet little girls. Well, after a good night's rest, I'm sure she'll be ready to face the world again. He took her bags from her. Is there more? She nodded. We put 2 trunks in the baggage compartment. She pointed to the corner of the platform. She and Emily were the only people who had gotten off at the small station. I'll have to have someone drive those to my home because they won't fit in the buggy. Do you have everything you need for a night or 2? Of course. Even if they didn't, she'd make do. She couldn't inconvenience him more. I'll go arrange for delivery then. As he hurried off, Patsy watched him. He was a soft-spoken man, and seemed like he would make a good husband and doctor. She hoped she could help him with some of his deliveries, because she would miss being a midwife more than anything else. He was back a few minutes later. That's settled. Your trunks will be there tomorrow afternoon. Thank you. She took the arm he offered, still keeping a tight hold on Emily. The girl wasn't acting like herself, and she was sure it was just how tired she was. Patsy was relieved though. She didn't want Emily to make a bad first impression. He lifted Emily into the buggy and then helped Patsy up as well. Patsy was a bit startled for a moment. She'd been doing for herself for so long, she'd forgotten how nice it was when a man was there to help. Once he was settled in the buggy beside her, he drove them through the calm streets toward the road headed to Butterfly Meadows. Tell me about your town. I simply adore the name. Wesley smiled at the question. He was glad she was asking about her new home. It's a small town, but I help the ranchers and farmers in the countryside surrounding the town as well. We have our own store and a post office. You'll find that we have what we need. We even have our own church and full-time preacher now. That sounds lovely. She leaned back, taking in the beautiful surroundings. It's very pretty here. I think it's one of the most beautiful places in our great nation. I took a year off between college and medical school to travel the country, and I've never seen a place like South Dakota. I'm sure Emily and I will be very happy here. She's a quiet girl, he commented, smiling at her. Not always. Patsy didn't want him to be deceived about her daughter's nature, because he'd be rudely awakened once the girl had a good night's sleep. She'd been running wild with her cousins for too long to keep up a deception. Wesley smiled at that, thinking maybe she meant the girl would open up once she got to know him. I'm sure the trip was difficult for both of you. Thank you for coming so quickly. I had to find another midwife to take my patients, but it wasn't terribly difficult. There were 3 of us that worked together often, covering one another. Beckham is a growing city. Well, you won't need to work anymore now that you're here. I certainly make enough to support my family. And he didn't want her midwifing any longer. He wasn't fond of the midwives he was acquainted with, thinking a doctor would always do a better job. I'm available to help with deliveries if you ever need me to, she offered, not wanting to push him on the issue quite yet. I thank you for that. He stopped the carriage in front of a small house beside a church. Pastor Robertson lives here. Oh, what a cute little parsonage. Do you live right in town, or are you in the country as well? I'm in town. My living quarters are behind my office. I have 3 bedrooms, so you'll find we have plenty of room. He walked around the wagon, helping her down, before reaching for Emily, who had fallen asleep. They walked slowly up the walk to the pastor's house, and he knocked on the door. A man came to the door, just moments later. Dr. Hardy. Come in. I take it this is your bride. He looked down at Emily, whose eyes were half closed. What a beautiful daughter your wife is bringing you. You must feel truly blessed. Wesley nodded, his eyes lit up. I feel more blessed by the minute. He smiled over at Patsy. She hadn't been exaggerating when she said her hair was red. It wasn't a strawberry blonde either, but a full, rich red. He loved it. The pastor smiled. Let me get my wife and daughter in here to witness the wedding, and we'll get down to business. While Emily slept on the couch, Patsy agreed to spend the rest of her life with a virtual stranger. She only hoped she wasn't making a mistake. As soon as the wedding was finalized, they got back in the buggy, and he drove them down the street. It took less than a minute to arrive in front of his office. I wish I could afford to take a day or 2 off to get you acquainted with life here, but I can't. She shrugged. It's no matter. It's a small town. I can find the general store on my own, and I'll meet people in church on Sunday. I don't foresee any problems getting to know everyone. He took her 2 bags and led the way through his office into a spacious area. When he'd called where he lived living quarters, she'd worried that their living space would be small, but it truly wasn't. There was a nice-sized kitchen, a separate dining room, and even a large parlor. Then there were 3 bedrooms, and to her surprise, a bathroom. He had electric throughout the space as well. She would want for nothing. As she looked around her, she could see that the place needed a good cleaning, and she was willing to take care of that right away. Why, it would be nice to spend some time cleaning and cooking without the worry of being constantly interrupted by someone needing her services. She would miss her work, though. He opened a door and said, "This is my bedroom." Then another. "This will be your room." And the last. And I thought this would be good for Emily. Patsy looked at him, startled. We won't be sharing a room? He shook his head. We just met a few hours ago. I thought I'd spare you that, and we'll take some time to get to know one another first. More than anything, I need someone to do the cooking and cleaning. I'm not good at either of those chores, and I get tired of living in my own filth. She wasn't sure how she felt about that, but she wasn't going to argue with him when Emily was barely able to stay on her feet. I see. I'll just get Emily ready for bed. She could see the sun was already going down, and poor Emily wasn't going to be able to stand for much longer. They'd had a sandwich right before getting off the train, so she'd be fine with no supper. She carried the 2 bags into Emily's room, looking around and thinking how many changes would need to be made. Her new husband had put a couple of china dolls in beautiful silk gowns on the dresser. There was no telling what Emily would do to dolls like that. She quickly stripped the dress off her daughter, pulling her nightgown over her head. Usually, Emily insisted on doing everything for herself, so it was a testament to how very tired she was that she didn't complain. Patsy put the girl on the bed and removed her shoes before tucking her under the covers. Sitting on the edge of her daughter's bed, Patsy spoke to her softly. We're at our new house now. You go to sleep, and when you wake up tomorrow, we'll have some time to explore. She leaned down, pressing a kiss to her little girl's forehead. Good night, Sheriff. She'd once said, good night, Princess, but that had really riled Emily up. She wasn't a princess, and she refused to even consider the possibility. Who would want to be a princess when it meant she couldn't get her dress dirty? Good night, Mama. Emily's eyes were already closed. Patsy took both of their bags and left the small bedroom, going to her own. She left the door open as she quickly unpacked the few things that were still clean from her bag. She'd made sure to leave a day dress unworn, so she'd have something to wear on her first day. She had many more dresses in her trunks, but she hadn't been certain if she would have to wait for those. She looked through the room that was hers, pleased that it was so spacious. Really, they'd want for nothing here, which was a good thing. She missed home, though. She quickly penned letters to both her mother, to let her know they'd arrived safely, and to Elizabeth Tandy. Elizabeth had accompanied her to the train station, warning her not to stay with a man who was unkind to her. Patsy had been surprised when the woman spoke of the way men were sometimes unkind to their wives. It wasn't usually a topic for conversation, but she appreciated it. As a midwife, she'd seen a great deal more abusive women than she cared to think about. When she heard Wesley moving around in his room, she guessed that she'd been dismissed for the night. It was odd, but she was a little relieved. One of the reasons she'd wanted to marry was she'd missed what so many women termed their wifely duties, so his decision to wait had been unexpected as well as unwanted. She'd talk to him about it later, though. A day or two to get to know him first might be what she needed. She closed her door, changed into her nightgown, and slipped under the covers. She would have no problem sleeping tonight. A bed that wasn't moving would feel like a luxury for some time to come, she was certain. Asterisk. It was still dark out when Patsy woke the next morning, so she tiptoed into the parlor and peered at the clock. It was after 5, so time to be up. She went back to her room and dressed for the day, hurrying into the kitchen. She did a quick inventory before she started cooking to see what she had to work with. This first morning, she'd make pancakes and bacon, which was simple. She could see she had a long day of baking and laundry ahead of her. Once she had breakfast prepared and waiting atop the stove, where it would stay warm, she went back to Emily's room and woke her. It's time to get up, baby. Emily sat up, rubbing her eyes. I'm still so tired. I know. Can I sleep just a little longer? Patsy sighed, debating. She wanted Emily to make a good first impression, but she also knew how desperately her daughter needed the sleep. Finally, she nodded. Yes, sleep a little more. We'll start your day later today if you promise to go to bed when I tell you with no arguments this evening. Emily nodded. Yes, Mama. She sank back under the covers, her eyes closed before her head hit the pillow. The poor thing needs her rest. Tomorrow will be soon enough to get her into a proper routine. When she got back to the kitchen, Wesley was there, pouring himself a cup of the coffee she'd made. "Good morning," she said softly. If he'd been her first husband, Joseph, she'd have rushed to his arms to kiss him good morning. Wesley had made it clear he didn't want that nonsense. At least not yet. He turned to her with a smile. "I haven't had coffee waiting for me when I woke up since I was in medical school." "Thank you so much." She smiled. "I think that's part of what's expected of me here, right?" He nodded. "Does it bother you that I have specific expectations of you?" "Of course not. I plan to be a good wife to you." "Did you find your room and your bed comfortable?" he asked, watching her over the rim of his cup. "Absolutely. I slept like a baby. I told Emily she could sleep a little longer. I've never seen her that tired." He frowned. "You don't think she's getting sick, do you?" Patsy shook her head. "I think she was just on a train for over a week, and she's exhausted. She'll be fine once she catches up on her sleep." "Did you find everything you need this morning?" "No, I didn't. I found enough to make do, but I'll need to do some shopping if I want to be able to prepare good, wholesome meals. I presume you won't have a problem if I go to the general store this morning and purchase what I'll need." "Not at all. I think that would be wonderful." He shrugged, taking a seat at the table and waiting for her to bring him his breakfast. Sending off for a wife was going to be the best thing he ever did for himself. Chapter 3. Patsy spent her morning working hard to get the clothes washed and on the line, while also baking bread and doing her best to catch up on cleaning. She had lunch ready for Wesley when he came in at noon, and Emily was finally alert for the first time since she'd met him. Wesley watched the little girl, who seemed to be a great deal more outgoing than she had been the previous night. He was pleased to see that he'd been right, and now that she was more comfortable with him, she was willing to speak. "What are your plans for the afternoon?" he asked. Patsy thought for a moment. She'd made a list, and she had to think about what hadn't yet been finished. "I need to go to the store to get some things now that Emily has finally found her way back to the land of the living. And I need to finish the laundry and do some more cleaning. I'm trying to get the late spring cleaning done, or is it early fall cleaning at this point?" He shrugged. "Whichever it is, I appreciate you getting it done. I admit to not keeping up with housework as well as a woman would. I'll get it caught up in no time. It's really not a big deal." She looked over at Emily, who was shoveling food into her mouth so quickly Patsy was afraid she'd choke. "Slow down. I know you're hungry because you missed breakfast, but you don't want to make yourself sick." Emily frowned, but she slowed down as asked. Wesley smiled at the girl, happy she was so obedient. He knew she was going to be an absolute joy to him. He could see it in everything she did. "School's out until the 1st of September. We'll need to enroll her then." Patsy nodded. "I'll take her the first day. She already reads and does sums very well." Her mother had worked a great deal with the girl, reading to her as well as telling her stories of Irish legends. Her Emily was as bright as she was headstrong. "Has she been to school before?" "No, she wasn't old enough last year. But I was smart enough," Emily told him. "I'm brilliant, you know." He was startled for a moment, before he laughed. "I can see that. Modest too." He finished his lunch. "I'm doing calls this afternoon, so I won't be around until supper time. My normal routine is to see patients in my office in the morning, and then I go to my house calls in the afternoon." She nodded. "That's fine. Will you join us for lunch every day?" "Most likely. Unless there's an emergency, but those do happen in my line of work." "I know they do. I'll try to work around them when they occur. Shortly after he left for lunch, she took Emily by the hand and they walked to the store, where she found the staples she needed for their meals. Do you sell fresh meat as well? The man who'd introduced himself as Percival nodded. Yes, ma'am. We sell a little bit of everything here. I have fresh meat brought in every day. Oh, good. That will make my life a lot easier. Emily was crouching in front of a shelf, staring with wide eyes at a baseball. Mama? May I have this ball, please? Patsy sighed, wishing she knew how to interest her daughter in things that were more traditionally female pursuits. If I buy the ball, will you spend an equal amount of time cooking with me as you do playing with it? She knew the only way to get her daughter to do girl things was to bribe her, and she really wasn't too proud to do it. Emily nodded grudgingly. Yes, ma'am. She purchased what she needed for supper for the next few nights, a few other supplies, and the baseball Emily wanted so badly. When she took money from her purse, Percival stopped her. Oh no, Mrs. Hardy. Dr. Hardy told me to put anything you need on his account. She nodded, feeling funny. She hadn't relied on a man for finances in years, and it felt strange to allow one to pay for what she needed, but she wasn't going to argue. She'd use the money she had saved for other things she might need. Patsy left the store with her shopping basket over one arm, while Emily clutched her baseball. Both of them were satisfied with their purchases. As soon as she got into the house, she started the roast she'd purchased for supper, peeling potatoes and carrots to put them into the same pot to cook. Then she went out to remove her laundry from the line. As she was taking the last sheet off the line, a man stopped his wagon in front of the office, helping his wife from the back. Where's the doctor? He called. My wife's having a baby. Give me a minute, and I'll meet you in his office, she called, grabbing the laundry and taking it inside. She had no idea where Wesley was that afternoon, so she'd have to deliver the baby herself if the woman's labor was progressed as far as her husband obviously thought it was. She put her things down and gave Emily very specific instructions as to where she could play. She wanted to be able to look out the window and see her daughter if she was outside. She quickly pulled on her apron that covered her dress and sleeves and rushed into the office, meeting the couple. I'm Mrs. Hardy. Dr. Hardy is out doing house calls, but I'm a trained midwife. I can help you. The husband and wife exchanged a look, as if they were trying to decide if they trusted the woman in front of him. While they were still undecided, she had another contraction, grabbing her belly and crying out. Patsy didn't wait for them to decide. Instead, she put her shoulder under the woman's arm and helped her to the table in the examining room. What's your name? The man frowned, obviously at a loss for what to do. I'm John and that's Betty. She's carrying our first. Patsy nodded, hurrying over to wash her hands thoroughly. Do you want to be here when your child is born, John? She knew most men preferred to be far away from a birthing, but she had known a few who wanted to stay. The young man's eyes widened, and he shook his head emphatically. Oh no, ma'am. I can't think of anything I'd like less than that. Patsy didn't laugh, but she wanted to. Go on out while I see how her labor is progressing then. Maybe you can go over to the general store and waste some time there. John hurried from the room, and Patsy focused all her attention on her patient. I need to examine you to see if everything is going correctly. Do you mind? It really didn't matter if the woman did mind. She'd check her regardless, but she preferred not to touch any woman without her permission. Asterisk. When Wesley drove his buggy into town at the end of a long day, he sighed contentedly. He was about to go into the house to have dinner with his wife and his sweet new daughter. He could get used to a life where he was surrounded by feminine beauty. After unhitching his buggy and seeing the horse stalled in the livery, he made the short walk toward his office. He was still far away when he noticed a small street urchin playing beside his home, covered in mud from head to toe. Hating the idea of a wild child being so close to his daughter, he sighed, planning to chase the boy off as soon as he was close enough to do so. The closer he got to home, the more the child looked like a girl, and not a boy though. What kind of girl played in the mud that way? Girls should sit inside with their dolls and their embroidery. When he was close enough, he called out, "You there? You need to go home and tell your mother to wash you." The child looked at him. "I can't. My mama told me not to leave this spot until she was done." "Done what?" "Birthing the baby." She looked away from him and went on with her creation of balls of mud. He blinked a couple of times. "Emily?" The girl nodded. "Yes, Dr. Hardy." "You didn't know it was me?" Wesley shook his head, suddenly not nearly as worried about the child as he was about his wife helping someone birth a baby. What did she think she was doing? It wasn't her job to help his patients. He walked into the office, hearing a baby cry. He peeked into his examining room, spotting Patsy smiling down at a woman, holding a newborn. "Do you want me to go get your husband? Are you feeling strong enough?" Betty sat up, swinging her legs over the side of the table. "I'm tired, but I think I should be." "I'm so glad you were here to help me, Mrs. Hardy." Wesley bit back the angry retort. "I'd like to check on my patient and the baby while you go find her husband." Patsy looked at him, smiling. She was so pleased she'd been able to help him. She removed the apron she'd worn, which was now covered in blood, and headed for the door. "I'll be back in just a minute." Wesley examined the woman, finding no fault with anything that his wife had done, except the fact that she'd done it. The cord was cut perfectly, and the woman had a poultice on her to stop the bleeding faster. "You seem fine." He helped her sit up, looking down at the baby in her arms. "Let me examine him." "It's a girl," Betty responded, tears in her eyes. "I had a little girl." He grinned. "What will you name her?" He loved when his patients were so excited about new life. It made him feel like he was doing something right. Of course, this time his wife had delivered the baby. He took the little girl from her, carefully removing her diaper and checking her over. She looked perfect. "All right, you can put the diaper back on her." He never could figure out how to refasten the things. The woman carefully got down from the bed and pinned the diaper closed. "I'm thankful your wife was here." Wesley smiled and nodded, all the while seething with anger. She had no business delivering babies for his patients. "I'm glad everything went well." Patsy was back with John then, and the man rushed to his wife and baby. "Mrs. Hardy wouldn't tell me if it was a boy or a girl." Betty grinned at him. "It's a girl. We only had a boy's name picked out," he said with a frown. Then his eyes lit up. "What's your name, Mrs. Hardy?" "Patsy." She'd had more babies named after her than she could count. So many grateful fathers wanted to name their daughters after her, and there were even several Patricks running around that she knew of. The couple exchanged a look, and the wife nodded. "She'll be Patsy then." "I'm honored," Patsy said softly, as if it was the first time a couple had bestowed that privilege upon her. As Wesley and John got Betty and baby Patsy into the wagon, she hurriedly cleaned up the mess made in the examining room. There were a few blood splatters, and she needed to change the sheet on the bed. When Wesley came back into the room, she waited for him to tell her how pleased he was with her. That he was thrilled someone had been there for his patient when he couldn't be. She finished stripping the bed and remade it. When she looked up at Wesley, the anger in his eyes was almost enough to make her run. "Why did you deliver that baby? You had no right to touch my patient." She stared at him in disbelief. "What was I supposed to do? Tell her to cross her legs until you were done working for the day? I didn't know how to find you." He stared at her for a moment, making fists as he tried to calm his anger. Finally, he stomped off toward the house. She could finish cleaning up the clinic on her own. When Patsy walked back into the house, she removed the roast from the oven and carefully poured the drippings into a small pot so she could make gravy to go with their meal. She had fresh bread ready to go with their supper, and she'd scrubbed the house all morning. She'd put in a long day's work before she'd ever bothered to deliver a baby, to help him. How dare he complain when she'd helped him with his job? She heard the back door open and looked up, seeing that Emily was about to come into the house. She shook her head at the state her daughter was in, but really, she wasn't surprised. She'd been watching her whenever she could look out the window. "Leave your shoes outside, and take your dress off. Just leave your petticoat on." Emily did as she was told, because they'd been through the routine many times before. "Now go into the bathroom and clean yourself up. I want your hair to be completely free of mud before supper." She could see Emily wanted to complain, but she knew better. "Yes, Mama." When she had finished with the gravy, she set the table and put the food into the middle so they could all serve themselves. Emily came back into the room, wearing a clean dress, her hair wet, but brushed. "Much better." Patsy sighed. "Run and find Dr. Hardy for me. It's time for supper." "He's in the parlor." "Go tell him it's time for supper then." Patsy wasn't sure she was willing to even look at the man, let alone speak to him. "Yes, Mama." A minute later, Emily returned with her new stepfather in tow. Once they were all seated, he said a prayer for them before they ate. Wesley was still angry, but he took one bite of her pot roast, and he gave a sigh. "Where did you learn to cook this way?" "My mother taught me." "This is delicious." "Thank you." She didn't want to respond at all, and was suddenly glad they weren't sharing a bed yet. She didn't want there to be a scene when she sent him to spend the night on the sofa. "My mother died in childbirth, because a midwife wasn't careful and didn't wash her hands," he said softly, trying to help her understand his position. "That woman should be shot, and I hope all of her patients went to real midwives after that." Patsy sighed. "I've never lost a patient. I've lost babies, but not mothers. I'm very thorough in my hand washing and all other sterility standards. I could see that when I examined Betty. You did a good job." His words were grudging, but he had always believed in giving praise where it was due. "I'm a very good midwife. I've been practicing for 10 years now. I'd rather you didn't deliver babies for my patients." "What do you want me to do then? What should I have done today?" "I wasn't trying to take your patient from you. I was trying to help her." "I know that. I feel so strongly about midwives not being the right person to deliver a baby." She took a bite of her potatoes, trying to keep the anger from her eyes. "I actually feel the same way about doctors. I don't think they have a personal relationship with their patients the way a midwife does. I would be willing to bet a lot of money that I've delivered more babies than you have." He frowned. "I doubt that. I've delivered 27 babies." She chuckled. "I've delivered more than that this year alone. I promise not to try to get your patients to come to me instead, but if there's another woman in labor, and you can't be found, I'm going to deliver that baby. We'll try to avoid that circumstance then. I can see where you'd feel the need to deliver the baby if I couldn't be found. If I'm there, though, you'll stay out of the way? Unless you need me." What else could she say? She'd come there to be his wife, not a midwife. She couldn't ignore her training, though. If she was needed, she would help in whatever capacity she could. Chapter 4. After Patsy and Emily finished the dishes, and Patsy had put her daughter to bed, Wesley asked his wife to come to the parlor to talk to him. She took a deep breath, having a strong feeling whatever he wanted to talk about would not be to her liking. The man was already making her crazy. She felt a strong attraction to him, but he was too bull-headed for her tastes. She went into the parlor and found him sitting on the sofa, reading what appeared to be a medical text. He patted the seat beside him, inviting her to sit with him. She wasn't sure she wanted to at that point, but she obeyed. Once she was seated, he took her hand in his. "I'm sorry I was so angry with you earlier. That was really unfair to you when you took your afternoon to do my job for me." She nodded, letting out a breath. "I forgive you. I should have told you how I felt about midwives before, but I didn't think something like that would come up so quickly. I honestly wouldn't do it any other way tomorrow. I'm sorry if that upsets you, but I can't ignore my training and not help." He frowned. "Of course you can't. I can see that you did the right thing, no matter how much it bothers me." He shook his head. "That's not why I asked you to come in here, though." "Oh? Did my eyes deceive me, or was Emily covered in mud when I got home from my house calls?" She sighed. She was most definitely covered in mud. "I have worked a lot since her birth. My sister had 4 sons, one who was just a month older than Emily. She would keep Emily for me while I worked, even nursing her when necessary, so Emily has grown up around 4 male cousins. She has taken on many of their bad habits. And now that you're here, you'll take her in hand?" Patsy shrugged. "I'll try. I'm not sure how easy that will be, though. Does she know how to embroider?" I love the idea of a little girl who can embroider. "No, she knows how to throw a baseball, and is really good at striking all the boys out, though." He shook his head. "Really? Will you teach her to embroider?" "I'll try. We'll start tomorrow if that will make you happy." She had no idea why he felt that Emily should be able to embroider, but if it was important to him, she'd teach her. He took her hand in his. "I know we haven't gotten off to a great start, but I think you and Emily are what I needed in my life." She smiled at that, turning more fully toward him, her eyes going to his lips. When the pastor had told him to kiss her the previous day, he'd pressed a chaste kiss to her cheek. She couldn't help but wonder how his lips would feel against hers. She felt a slight tingling in her belly at the idea. Wesley looked down into Patsy's face, noting that her eyes were on his lips. Was she wondering about kissing him? He had no experience with women at all, not even a little. He'd taken girls to dances, but he'd never even kissed one. He knew she'd been married before, and had a daughter, so he worried if he did kiss her, she'd know how inexperienced he was. She swayed toward him, and he cupped her face with his free hand, leaning down and pressing his lips to hers. Her hand went to the nape of his neck, her fingers gently caressing it. She wanted to tell him she didn't need time, but she didn't want to seem too forward either. He was startled by how soft her lips were beneath his, and his tongue came out to taste her, just a little. He groaned, dropping her hand and pulling her closer against him. When he pulled away, Patsy kept her eyes closed, her lips slightly parted. She had that spark with him, the same one she'd had with her first husband, and she was so grateful. That spark would make their lives together good and special. Finally, her eyes opened, and she found him staring down into her face. "What?" she asked, her voice full of wonder. She hadn't believed she could find another man she responded to so well. She still couldn't quite believe it. "You're beautiful. When I put that note in the letter, saying I wanted a redhead, I never thought I'd find one." She smiled. "I've known Elizabeth for years. When she got your letter, she immediately thought of me." "Really? Were you already a client?" Patsy shook her head. "I went to her house the day after she got your letter, but she'd already put my name on her list beside yours." He smiled at that. "Very good timing then, I suppose." She nodded. "I've been meaning to talk to you about something." Her eyes didn't meet his, and she stared over his shoulder as she brought up the difficult topic. "We don't have to wait to consummate unless you just want to." "I wouldn't mind." She wanted to laugh at herself. One little kiss and her body was on fire. She wouldn't mind? I think it's best if we get to know one another a little better first. He wanted to read up on it more. He was a doctor, and of course he understood how it would work, but actually doing it was something different. No, he'd have to study up on it, just like it was a test. Maybe in a week or two? She nodded. Just remember I'm willing. She pulled his head down for one more quick kiss, before getting to her feet. I had a long day today, and I think tomorrow will be just as long. I'd best get to bed. Good night, my dear. He'd never thought of using an endearment with someone, and calling her dear struck him by surprise. He liked it though. He was surprised by how much he liked being married to her. She smiled. Good night. As she changed into her nightgown and slipped between the sheets, she still had a slight smile on her face. She touched her lips as she rolled onto her side. She was going to like being married to the good doctor. She could see it already. Asterisk. After Wesley left for the office the next morning, Patsy put on one of her big aprons and started the task of cleaning in earnest. She wanted to wash down the walls and the floors and every window before he was done with his day. But she also wanted to make sure she made a good supper for him, complete with a cake for dessert. He obviously hadn't been spoiled in some time, and she aimed to change that. The first interruption came just after she finished the breakfast dishes. She had Emily sitting at the table working on her math sums. She wouldn't be allowed to play outside unless Patsy could supervise her more closely. It was obvious her new husband did not approve of her daughter's tomboyish ways. She started at the knock on the door, hurrying to see who could be there. She didn't know anyone yet. It was a young woman, probably in her late teens, whose belly was huge with child. Come in and sit down. You don't need to be on your feet any more than necessary in your condition. Let me make some tea, and we'll have some bread with butter. I'm sorry, but I haven't gotten around to baking cookies yet. Thank you, Mrs. Hardy. When Patsy returned to the soon-to-be mother, she offered her a cup of the tea she made and sat down on the sofa beside her. I'm happy you came by. I'm looking forward to meeting all my new neighbors. I'm not here just to be neighborly, I'm afraid. The girl set her cup onto her saucer. I'm hoping you'll deliver my baby. Patsy had been afraid of that. Tell me why. You've been seeing Dr. Hardy? Yes, ma'am. What's your name first? Let's start there. Patsy wanted to laugh at herself. She was sitting in her parlor, giving the woman tea with bread and butter, and she didn't even know her name yet. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm June Miller. I'm due to have this baby in another few weeks. I was told that you delivered Betty's baby yesterday. Yes, I did. A beautiful little girl. Patsy smiled to encourage June to continue. To be real honest, my husband doesn't like another man being the one to examine me. He thinks that it should be a woman. June looked down at her hands. And I agree with him. It doesn't feel natural for a man to be helping me birth my baby. It should be a woman. Patsy sighed. My husband has asked that I let him handle the deliveries of the babies. June's eyes filled with tears. When I heard there was a midwife in town, I was so relieved. Please say you'll help me. Let me talk to my husband about it. About what? Wesley stood in the entryway from the kitchen, frowning down at them. Patsy took a deep breath, not wanting to have this discussion with him, and especially not in front of June. Mrs. Miller came to see me to ask me to deliver her baby. She feels more comfortable having a woman do it than a man. Wesley frowned. Why is that? Have I done something wrong, Mrs. Miller? June shook her head adamantly. Not at all. It just feels unnatural for a man other than my husband to see me there. It's nothing you've done wrong at all. You realize that as a doctor, I have more advanced training than a midwife does. That if something were to go wrong, I'd be able to perform a cesarean section to save the baby. I don't even know what that is. I just know I'd rather have a woman midwife than a man doctor. Please understand. Wesley nodded. Fine. If that's what you'd prefer, by all means, I will have my wife deliver your baby. Inside, he wanted to scream. Yes, she'd proven she could deliver a baby, but that didn't mean she should. I forgot something I needed and happened to overhear the conversation. I'll be home for lunch. He turned and left the room, leaving Patsy to stare after him. She hated the position she was in. She wanted to help people, and she had the training to do it, but it made her husband unhappy. She wasn't quite sure of the right thing to do. June smiled at her, gripping her hand. Thank you so much, Mrs. Hardy. Patsy smiled. Please, call me Patsy. We're obviously going to be getting to know each other better. I'd like to examine you to make certain that everything is going well. When was the last time you saw Dr. Hardy? About a month ago. That long? She preferred to see patients weekly when they were in the later stages of pregnancy. Yes, ma'am. I've been seeing him less often than he wants me to. Are you going to stick to the appointment schedule I give you? I need to know you're going to be here and doing what you're told. Yes, ma'am. Of course. I'll do whatever you say. Patsy called out to Emily. I want you to stay at the table. If you finish your arithmetic, please just draw a picture. I'm going to be in my room examining Mrs. Miller. Yes, Mama. Emily had been through this many times with her mother. She understood well that it was her mama's job to make sure women had healthy babies. Patsy led June into her bedroom and had her lie down, getting her midwife bag. She got her stethoscope out and listened to the baby's heartbeat for a moment. He sounds strong. Have you had the chance to hear him yet? June's eyes grew wide, and she shook her head. Is that something I can do? Patsy laughed. I always let my patients listen to the heartbeat. That's your baby in there, not mine. As she said the words, she realized just how much she wanted another baby. A little boy this time, maybe. She removed the stethoscope from her ears and handed it to June, finding the same spot where she'd just heard the heartbeat. June's eyes lit up and she gasped. There's really a little person alive in there. Patsy smiled, nodding. There really is. It's one of the most amazing feelings in the world, isn't it? She carefully checked the other woman while she was occupied listening to the baby. And you're due in a few weeks, you said? June nodded. 2 or 3, I think. All right. I'll want to see you again a week from today. And as soon as your labor pains start, you send someone for me. You don't want me to come here to have the baby? No. I'd rather you delivered in the comfort of your own home. Wouldn't you? Yes, ma'am. Thank you for understanding so well. Patsy smiled. I'm a midwife, but I'm also a mother. I was so happy to be able to have my baby at home. I heard you delivered Betty's baby here in town. I did. But only because she came to me just before she was about to have her. There was no way we could move her safely. Patsy patted the girl's arm. Go ahead and sit up now. There's nothing wrong? Nothing at all. I'll see you in a week, and hopefully we'll have a better idea when the baby is coming. This is your first? Yes, ma'am. I've only been married a year. Patsy smiled at that. We'll do our best to give you a healthy delivery. June hugged her. Thank you, Mrs. Hardy. Your arrival here is like a dream come true for most of the ladies in town. Patsy sighed. She and her husband were going to have troubles. She could already see it. Chapter 5. For more pregnant women visited Patsy before lunchtime. She worked hard to bake cookies in between patients, because she wanted to have something to offer them while they sat and talked. At lunchtime, Wesley seemed annoyed, and she didn't know how to make things better between them. I'm sorry. I hope you know this wasn't deliberate. I didn't want to keep working the crazy hours of a midwife. She'd already told him about the other 4 women who had come in. I know it wasn't, but I wanted a full-time wife. Not a part-time wife and a part-time midwife. She frowned down at the food on her plate. I know. I don't know how to stop people from preferring a female to a male, though. And that's the bottom line for every one of these women. They'd rather have a woman delivering their babies than a man. Wesley nodded abruptly. My days are already too busy. You will be taking some of the load off me, and I suppose I should be grateful, but it just feels like things are spinning out of control. I like things controlled and orderly. He looked at Emily. Do you mind when your mama works? Emily shook her head. No, because if she's not working, I don't get to play in the mud or climb trees or practice throwing my baseball. Well, you shouldn't be doing those things anyway. Boys do those things. The little girl blinked at him. Why do you say that? I play baseball better than most boys. What does being a girl have to do with anything? Wesley shook his head at her. Because girls should stay indoors and play with dolls or embroider. Really? Are boys allowed to embroider? I suppose they could if they wanted to, but I don't think a boy would want to. Well, that's not fair then. I do want to climb a tree. Why can't I do that? Emily asked. He sighed. It's just not how things are supposed to be done. You should want to wear frilly dresses and play with dolls. Frilly dresses? Frilly dresses? Frilly dresses are made of fairy puke. Patsy jerked. Watch your language. Sorry, Mama. Fairy vomit then. Is that better? Patsy shook her head. What am I going to do with you? Wesley looked back and forth between his new wife and her daughter. What on earth had he gotten himself into? Asterisk. By the end of the week, Patsy had 10 patients, and a husband who wasn't certain how he felt about the situation. On Friday evening, the 2 of them sat down together in the parlor after Emily had been tucked into bed. Wesley shook his head at her, even as his hand reached out for hers. I'm not even sure what to say about this. I never thought taking a wife would lighten my workload, nor did I want it to. I'm not doing anything to make this happen. The women are just talking, and after they do, I get another knock on the door. He sighed. Well, I think we should make accommodations for it, since the situation doesn't seem to be rectifying itself. What do you mean? Since I'm out on calls in the afternoons, why don't you use my office? I'll keep using it in the mornings. Do you think that would work? She nodded. Are you sure you don't mind? She'd just been examining the women on her bed, and while it wasn't ideal, it worked. Once they were sharing a room, she could turn her bedroom into an examination room. I mind the whole situation, but I don't have a problem with you using my office in the afternoons. I just wish I knew what I'd done to make all these women, one of whom I've delivered 6 babies for, want to switch to you. Most women feel more comfortable with a woman delivering their babies. I don't know why, but I do know that it's true. When I agreed to be your wife, I thought maybe I'd be able to help you with deliveries, but I had no idea it would turn out this way. He frowned. If you worry that there might be something that could go awry with a delivery, would you send the patient to me? Oh, yes. I won't risk anyone's life. Every woman needs to see the person who can best help them. Some women are not meant to have a midwife deliver their baby. They need a doctor. I'm glad you can see that. He turned to her. I don't know why I envisioned getting a wife and daughter would be a calm, easy transition. You 2 have turned not only me, but this entire town on its ear. Patsy blushed. I don't think that's true. Emily threw her baseball at that boy who said girls couldn't play ball, and hit him in the middle of the forehead, leaving a knot that required him to be seen by me. I'm glad he didn't have a concussion. Yes, but now she has a team to play with. And they always win. No one can hit off her fastball. She's a 7-year-old girl. How is she ever going to find a husband if she doesn't start acting more ladylike? Patsy shrugged. I have no idea. I just know she's not happy unless she's running around being boisterous. I try to watch her, but when the ladies come to talk to me about midwifing, I don't know what to do except let her play. She took a deep breath, hating that her daughter's boyish nature bothered him. Besides, by the time she's of marriageable age, she'll most likely have calmed down. Have you tried to get her to play with her dolls? Wesley knew that if the child just stayed occupied, she'd stay out of trouble. She sighed. If she only has dolls to play with, she tends to sever their limbs and pretend they were blown off by a cannon. That's what her cousins did to her dolls when she was little, so she thinks that's how you're supposed to play with dolls. He blinked a couple of times. She's never played with other girls? She doesn't like other girls. They're all too worried about getting their dresses dirty, and they won't play in the mud with her. Or go fishing. Or even climb trees. I'll have to see if I can find her a suitable playmate. Patsy frowned. You can't just accept that she's not like other girls and wait for her to grow out of it? It's not that I don't accept her as she is, because of course I do. I just think she'll be much happier if she's doing things that are more suitable to a girl her age. Like playing with dolls and doing embroidery. Yes, exactly like that. I'll try. Again. She knew it was useless, but he was her husband. She'd listen to him as much as she could. As long as it didn't mean hurting her daughter in the process. I hope you don't think I'm criticizing her. I just know she'll be happier if she can learn now to be more like other girls. Patsy nodded, reaching up to remove a pin that was stabbing into the back of her head. It had been another very long day. Do you work tomorrow? He nodded. I usually work on Saturday mornings, and then I take Saturday afternoons and Sundays off. His eyes were glued to her hair, which was all starting to fall after the pin she'd removed. He reached out and touched the back of her head, finding another pin and removing it. And then another. It took him less than a minute to have her hair spilling down around her shoulders, and his eyes widened with awe. How long is your hair? She stood, letting her hair fall down around her. About that long. It was past her bottom. She hadn't ever cut it. May I touch it? She nodded. Of course. You're my husband. She sat back down beside him, and he reached out to stroke her hair away from her face. I don't know why I've always been fascinated by red hair, but I have. I would love it if you'd let me brush it sometime. She blushed, slightly embarrassed. It's just hair, but sure. I wouldn't mind if you brushed it. Really? You'd let me? She nodded. It'll save me the work. It takes forever to brush it every night before bed. Go get your hairbrush. I'll do it now so you don't have to. He knew he was acting too eager, but he couldn't help it. His whole life he'd loved red hair, and he so badly wanted to brush hers. He wiped his palms on his pants, because they were all sweaty at the mere thought. She wasn't sure why he was so interested in her hair, but she hurried away to her room and brought back her hairbrush. Instead of sitting beside him again, she sat on the floor at his feet, crossing her legs beneath her. It's how she had Emily sit when she had to fix her hair, and she knew it would be easier for him. Wesley took the brush she handed him over her shoulder, spreading his legs, so she could rest her back against the sofa. He'd pictured sitting like this with her over and over since they'd first met. Have you ever brushed a woman's hair before? Patsy asked as he hesitated. No, I can't say the opportunity has ever arisen. He frowned. He wanted to do it, but he wasn't sure the best way to go about it. Separate it into sections, and then brush each section several times before moving on to the next. That seems reasonable. He took a handful of hair and ran the brush through it, amazed at how silky it felt in his fingers. He wanted to run her hair across his lips, but he felt that would be asking way too much, given their relationship. He'd known her for less than a week, after all. Patsy tilted her head forward to give him access and enjoyed the motions of the brush drifting through her hair. Having her hair brushed had never seemed sensual to her before, but she'd never had a man brush it for her. He worked for over an hour on her hair, both of them silent. Finally, he laid the brush down, his arm tired from the motions. He couldn't believe just how arousing touching her hair had been, and he almost felt as if he'd done something wrong, almost. "Thank you," she said softly. Truly, the whole experience had been eye-opening for her. "Anytime you want me to brush it for you, I will. I know it's strange, but I really enjoyed it." She rested her head against his thigh, knowing she was being bold, but no longer caring. "Anytime is fine with me." "May I kiss you?" Wesley asked softly. He hadn't kissed her since the second night she'd been there, and he felt shy asking. She got back onto the couch beside him, sitting close. "You don't have to ask, you know. You're my husband. I would never take advantage of that fact and touch you without your permission, though. You have my permission to touch me or kiss me whenever you like." "There, now you'll never have to ask again," she said with a grin, her hand moving up to touch his cheek. It was covered with stubble, because he had shaved early that morning before work, and it was late at night now. She liked the scratchy feel on her palm. When she and Joseph had been married, they'd both been very young, and his facial hair had never grown quite so quickly. Wesley looked into her eyes, brushing her hair over her shoulder, thrilled he had permission to touch it finally. "I'm never going to get tired of your hair." She laughed softly. "I've never thought of it as anything special. It always made me feel a bit different." "Because of the color?" His eyes moved down to her lips, and he thought about how soft they'd felt the one time he'd kissed her. She nodded. "Yeah. I didn't have any friends who had red hair. Just my mother, my sister, and me. It's so beautiful." He leaned down then, capturing her lips with his. This kiss wasn't a gentle, getting-to-know-you kiss like the first kiss they'd shared. His lips took hers boldly, his tongue swooping into her mouth to take possession, while his hands caught her by the waist and pulled her even closer. Patsy responded with the hunger her body felt, her arms wrapping around his neck and holding him tightly. This was the part of marriage she'd missed the most. The kissing and being close. It was long minutes later when Wesley lifted his head, his forehead resting against hers. He wanted to make love with his wife. He didn't want to wait any longer, but would she realize how inexperienced he was? Would it bother her? "I don't want to stop," he said softly, waiting for her response. He'd promised her time. If she would release him from that promise, then he would take her to his bed. If not, then he would wait. For as long as she needed to get to know him better. Patsy looked into his eyes. "I've been hoping you'd say that," she said with a grin. She got to her feet, taking his hand and pulling him after her toward his bedroom.